Have you ever thought about turning your hobby into a career? Or found a new hyperfixation that would make an amazing business? Are you constantly coming up with entrepreneurial ideas? Today we're going to talk about the intersection of ADHD and entrepreneurship. Hello and welcome to The Noise Coaching. If you haven't watched any of my videos before, my name is Lee and I am a leadership coach specialising in growing the careers of mid to senior neurospices. And today I want to talk about the relationship between ADHD and entrepreneurship. This video was inspired by one I did a few weeks ago, which talked about ADHD in the workplace and how our workplaces aren't always set up in a way that is ADHD friendly, and working can be particularly challenging for us. In fact, one of the papers I looked in that video noted that a lot of the participants had either become or expressed interest in becoming self-employed so they could work in a way that matched their specific needs. Working with your brain, as I like to call it. Since becoming an entrepreneur myself after years in corporate life, I found myself surrounded by people with ADHD, and I'm not sure if that's just me attracting them or whether there's loads of us out there. I actually think it might be a bit of both. It also makes me think about last week's video about ADHD and evolution, and the fact that ADHD could be maladaptive to our current modern day society because children are expected to self-regulate through a classroom all day, something that is super hard for ADHD. And I bet the same applies to adults. It's really hard to self-regulate all day in an office or on a shop floor or something like that we often have to do during work. So today we're going to look at whether this overlap is just anecdotal, it's not, and some of the reasons why we find entrepreneurship so attractive by looking at some of the papers and the latest research on this topic. So let's get going. The first paper I want to look at today is one called ADHD-like Behaviour and Entrepreneurial Intentions, published in 2015. I'd also like to admit at this point where I do like to credit the papers and always say where I'm getting my information from. I actually avoid reading out the authors' names because I'm always a little bit concerned that I'm going to butcher them and can't pronounce them properly. So here is a little glimpse behind the scenes for you today. This paper took what is by ADHD research terms a massive sample of 10,104 students, screened them for ADHD-like behaviours and asked them about their entrepreneurial intentions, and found that there was a higher overlap between ADHDers or ADHD-like behaviour and entrepreneurial intentions than the general population. I think I mentioned this in one of my earlier videos, but when I was at university I had free choice to take a module outside of my subjects and I chose business studies. And it had a sub-module on entrepreneurship, which I found so interesting and so exciting. And I told one of my friends about it and that I was potentially interested in becoming an entrepreneur. And he said to me, I think you have to be a certain kind of person to become an entrepreneur. And he left off the bit that he didn't think I was it, but that was pretty clear to me in this particular time. So turns out I have ADHD, and ADHDers are more likely to become entrepreneurs. So who's the type of person to become an entrepreneur now? This paper refers to past research on entrepreneurs and finds that they tend to have high energy, dare to pursue risky endeavours, and also are resilient in the face of adversity, and liken this to the ADHD, impulsivity and hyperactivity symptoms. Now I think about it, I can also see that kind of the fact that we do well in the crisis there with the whole resilience aspect of things as well. So I think that's probably tied in there as well. The point around resilience in times of adversity is interesting as well. Here's a quote. By experiencing the negative consequences of ADHD from early childhood, those individuals may develop a higher resistance to failure, as well as a way to cope with adversity and achieve success against significant odds. And it's actually not the only paper we'll look at today that mentions this. It's interesting because it goes against other research that I've done, which suggests that people who have ADHD tend to actually have lower resiliency. And I'm not sure if that's just because of stigma or because people that are maybe slightly more impaired have lower resiliency, but it is kind of refreshing to have acknowledgement of the fact that we do suffer more setbacks and hardships, and we are constantly finding ways and strategies to move forwards of them, and that is a measurement of resiliency in itself. The paper talks about the concept of person-environment fit, and how if we're in an environment that doesn't fit us as a person, we're not going to do as well as if we are in an environment that does fit us. And so the idea that being if we pursue entrepreneurship, then we can build an environment that does fit us. We have that flexibility too if we are entrepreneurs. I find this person-environment fit concept to be quite interesting for ADHD because we spend so much of our time, in fact all of our time, in a world that doesn't accommodate us, a world that's not designed for us, a world in which our person-environment fit isn't the best. And I like the point on resilience. I like that it acknowledges that because it's not our fault, and yeah, I just like that the paper has that acceptance in it. Entrepreneurship, in contrast, can be thought of being a better fit for us due to our resiliency, our impulsiveness, our risk tolerance, and so it would make sense that more people opt into entrepreneurship. However, one thing I do have to note about this study is it looks at ADHD-like behaviour, not ADHD diagnosis. It's not clear-cut that ADHD itself would have the same relationship with entrepreneurship. But that's where my second paper comes in. Entrepreneurship and Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, a large-scale study involving the clinical condition of ADHD, actually looked at this in people who are already clinically diagnosed. They were looking for the same thing. Are people who are clinically diagnosed with ADHD more likely to go into entrepreneurship than those who aren't? Fortunately for this paper, the answer was yes. They looked at 9,800 students and found that the ones who were diagnosed with ADHD were almost twice as likely to go into entrepreneurship than those who were not. I'm not going to dive too much into this paper because it highlights a lot of the same points as the one I've already discussed, but I did want to bring out one particular quote that I found really interesting. It says, "Given the myriad of unproductive and destructive behaviours linked to ADHD, entrepreneurial action may be a constructive outlet regardless of whether a venture is ultimately founded and successful." I've pondered on this a little. They don't really elaborate on what they mean by it being constructive, but thinking about it, I think it means from a perspective of having some benefit of our life, even if it's not financially successful in a way. And I think this is really important because for us ADHDers, we often feel like we're failing and we're keenly aware that we are failing. And so the idea that even if an entrepreneurial activity is not ultimately financially successful, it can still be some kind of benefit to our lives. I just think that's a really nice thought in there. Moving away from studies with large sample size, the next paper that I want to look at is on a much more intimate level and only looks at 14 people and interviews them directly, which I really like hearing from other ADHDers and our own lived experience. So I like this kind of paper a lot. There are some interesting insights in it that the previous two papers didn't pick up on. This paper is called Entrepreneurship and Psychological Disorders, How ADHD Can Be Productively Harnessed. And it incidentally makes a statement that the fact that ADHD is highly genetic and has been in the gene pool for a long time means that there's probably some kind of evolutionary reason as to why ADHD is about, or that it's a natural variation. And that is a topic that I spoke about in last week's video. So throughout the 10 hours of interviews, the authors were able to get a bit more of an idea of why these people had pursued entrepreneurship. And a lot of it actually comes back to that person-environment fit that I mentioned earlier. They found that all of their participants mentioned that one of the best aspects of being an entrepreneur was the fact that they managed to work with their brains. They managed to work at the time of day that worked better for them. They managed to match their energy levels, and they managed to work in a way that works for them because they had the freedom and the flexibility to. This is actually something that I'm still learning, and this week I've been making a few changes to try and work a little bit more in line with my own energy levels, so I can very much relate to that point. In a similar vein of why they made the jump, actually a lot of them mentioned being bored in their jobs and making the jump almost impulsively because they found something that they were more passionate about. And in fact, many of them started several endeavours at the same time. Not me starting two businesses at almost the exact same time. They did mention downsides to this, however. Namely that the fact that they could work to their own energy levels and their own sort of time frame meant that a lot of them were overworking and having trouble sleeping as a result. Given these entrepreneurs were starting businesses that they were passionate about, they invested a lot of time and energy into learning about it and becoming experts in their areas, which didn't leave a lot of time for things outside of work and sleep. What's interesting is that this was also viewed in a positive light, with many respondents saying that the higher capacity to work was actually one of the biggest pros of having ADHD. Again, this is something that makes me pause in context of other research that I've done, particularly the stuff I did a little while ago on ADHD and personality that said that people who have ADHD tend to be lower on conscientiousness, which implies that we don't work as hard, but these people are saying that their ability to work hard is one of the greatest pros to them of having ADHD. The duality of ADHD being seen as wholly negative in some circumstances but positive in other circumstances is why I do what I do. Because I believe that with the right support we can harness ADHD in a way that is positive and productive and moves us forwards in our lives and stops being a thing that is solely a source of struggle. While I'm ADHD neutral, in my research and the work I do in general, I read so much negativity and I hear so much negativity about ADHD. So reading studies like this, where ADHD can be seen in a positive light as well, is just really inspirational to me. And actually this paper ends in this space, relating it back to the topic from last week, saying that could ADHD be an evolutionary advantage? Could it be something that we're pre-adapted to something like entrepreneurship that is a different situation? Now, this video looks at why we're interested in entrepreneurship, why it appeals to us, why we tend to go into this, but it doesn't actually look at the question of, well, are we any good at it? Are we actually successful entrepreneurs? And so that's actually the topic I want to talk about next week. The answer is a bit, well, it depends. And so it's going to take a whole video to kind of get into what are the circumstances in which we tend to thrive in entrepreneur and what are the circumstances in which we tend to struggle a little bit more. On that note, this ADHD entrepreneur is out. Please like, comment and subscribe. And if you haven't seen it already, given the context of discussion, I really think you should go back and watch my video on whether ADHD is an evolutionary advantage from last week. Thank you very much for your attention.